Well, hello there. Today's weapons of rat destruction, the incentive, trust, cooperation loop, which we will explore by examining freedom without responsibility, a pragmatic case for linking choice to consequences. Opening scenario: the fragile promise. Imagine a workplace where everyone can choose their projects. At first, it feels liberating. No one is forced into tasks they dislike. But when deadlines slip, the blame always falls on circumstances. No one is held accountable. Within months, deadlines are missed more often, trust between colleagues fades, collaboration stalls. This is what happens when freedom is severed from responsibility. The form remains. People still choose, but the function collapses. The surface appeal of freedom. Freedom of choice promises autonomy, dignity, and the ability to shape one's own life. Groups that champion it often frame it as the ultimate safeguard against oppression, a right worth defending at all costs. But freedom is not just about having options. It's about the relationship between those options, the actions taken, and the outcomes that follow. When a group advocates for freedom of choice but consistently shames blame for harmful outcomes away from the chooser, it hollows out that relationship. The result is a freedom that looks intact but has lost its steering mechanism. The ActFoE framework begins with a simple operational principle. Action follows evidence, just as reaction follows stimulus. If the action taken doesn't roughly match the evidence available, then there will be a third factor at work: bias, hidden motive, or a cultural script influencing the decision. From that starting point, ActFoE asks, what concrete data or shared norm justifies this step? If a clear link exists, the decision is anchored and the actor owns the outcome. If no link exists, the framework pauses to identify the third factor and negotiate a qualitative reference point before moving forward. This step matters because it transforms an unanchored decision into one with an explicit, defensible rationale, restoring responsibility to the actor. The incentive, trust, cooperation loop. One of the most reliable patterns in social science, game theory, and organizational behavior is that incentives, trust, and cooperation form a feedback loop. This is a thing that has been observed in workplaces, communities, and even multi-agent simulations. Here's how it works in plain terms. Incentives. When people see a predictable link between what they do and what happens next, they adjust their behavior. Rewards for good actions and consequences for harmful ones act like a steering wheel. For example, in a workplace, meeting deadlines leads to recognition or bonuses. Missing them leads to corrective action. Trust. When incentives are applied fairly and consistently, people start to believe the system is reliable. Trust grows because they can predict how others and the system itself will respond. Example: if everyone is held to the same standard, colleagues trust that effort will be rewarded and misconduct addressed. Cooperation. Trust lowers the perceived risk of working together. People are more willing to share resources, coordinate efforts, and take joint risks when they believe others will act in good faith. Example: teams collaborate more freely when they trust that no one will exploit the group's effort. Because these elements feed into each other, breaking the link between choice and consequence sets off a chain reaction. Incentives lose their steering power, people stop expecting their actions to matter, trust erodes, fairness signals fade, and reliability becomes uncertain. Cooperation falters. Individuals withdraw effort, guard resources, and focus on self-protection. How freedom without responsibility breaks the loop. Now, let's apply that loop to the freedom without responsibility stance. When bad choices are consistently excused as entirely external, pinned on luck, systemic corruption, or other forces beyond the chooser's control, each part of the loop weakens. Positive incentives weaken. If success is credited to luck or outside forces, striving feels pointless. Negative incentives vanish. If harm carries no personal consequence, then there's no reason to avoid harmful actions. Trust declines. When harmful actions go unaddressed, people doubt the system's fairness and reliability. Cooperation suffers. Without trust, joint projects stall, and individuals focus on protecting themselves rather than contributing. And so while some argue that freedom can survive without responsibility, that external systems or goodwill will keep things running, in practice, those systems depend on responsibility at their core. Remove it, and the incentives that sustain them vanish, and with them, the trust and cooperation that make freedom workable. Why a group might choose this stance, assuming agency. If we assume the group does have agency, the capacity to make purposeful decisions and influence outcomes, then consistently deflecting responsibility is a strategic choice. Common drivers include identity protection. Shield members from blame preserves internal cohesion and a moral self-image. Narrative control. A single unifying explanation, the system is corrupt, is easier to communicate and recruit around than complex causality. Strategic deflection. Avoiding accountability sidesteps legal, reputational, or resource costs while keeping the rhetoric of freedom intact. Power dynamics. Victimhood narratives can justify demands for reform or special treatment and reinforce leadership authority. Psychological comfort. Blaming external forces reduces cognitive dissonance when outcomes conflict with self-belief and can preserve morale in the short term. These motivations can deliver short-term cohesion and appeal, but at the cost of weakening the incentive trust cooperation loop and risking drift toward a nothing matters mindset. ActFoE is useful here because it gives us a structured way to test whether a group's stance keeps the link between choice and consequence intact. It doesn't just ask, do they value freedom? It asks, is their freedom anchored to evidence, norms, or a consciously acknowledged third factor? It does assume agency as a working axiom, which means that when applied to a freedom without responsibility narrative, it will almost inevitably flag a breakdown. That assumption isn't hidden bias, it's deliberate. Without agency, the incentive trust cooperation loop collapses. By making this premise explicit, the framework lets readers see both the evaluation and the cost of rejecting its axiom. This transparency turns what could look like bias into a clear, testable standard for judgment. Agency as a meaning anchor. One of the ways ActFoE guards against drift into nothing matters thinking is through its nihilism defense module. This module uses meaning anchors, stable reference points that connect evidence to action in a way that preserves purpose. Think of meaning anchors as shared norms that assume people have the ability to act differently, both now and in the future. 3 of the most important are forgiveness of debts. This isn't just about money. It's the idea that someone can make amends, change their behavior, and start fresh. Forgiveness only makes sense if change is possible. Rule of law. Laws work because they presume accountability is real. If people couldn't choose their actions, holding them to legal standards would be meaningless. Hospitality. Welcoming someone into your space or community assumes goodwill is a choice they can make, that they can decide to act respectfully toward you. If you deny responsibility for bad choices, forgiveness becomes hollow because there's no capacity for change to reward. Law becomes arbitrary because accountability is no longer real. Hospitality becomes naive because goodwill is no longer a choice. Without these anchors, the bridge between evidence and action collapses, and the system loses its ability to preserve meaning. Pragmatic stance. This case doesn't require proving whether free will exists in a philosophical sense. Instead, it asks us to look at the practical consequences of acting as if people have agency, the capacity to make choices and be responsible for them. From an operational standpoint, if we overestimate agency, sometimes you'll assign responsibility to someone who truly had little control. That can lead to occasional unfairness, but the overall system still works. Incentives, trust, and cooperation remain intact. Underestimating agency. If you assume people have no control over their actions, responsibility disappears. Incentives stop steering behavior, trust erodes, and cooperation collapses. This section here is seen through a Darwinian cost-benefit lens, where the safer bet is clear. Maintaining the link between freedom and responsibility costs less in terms of social survival, than severing it. The survival cost of losing that link is far greater than the occasional misassignment of blame that comes from keeping it. In closing, freedom without responsibility is like a steering wheel disconnected from the wheels. It looks like control, but it doesn't guide the vehicle. If we want freedom to endure, we must defend not just the right to choose, but the responsibility to own the outcomes. ActFoE keeps that linkage intact by demanding evidence or shared norms before action, ensuring that every choice is anchored to something defensible. When no clear links exist, it requires identifying the third factor, bias, hidden motive, or cultural script, and making that rationale explicit before moving forward. This process maintains the incentive, trust, cooperation loop, reinforces meaning anchors like forgiveness of debts, rule of law, and hospitality, and resists the drift into nihilism that comes when choices carry no consequences. Without that linkage, choices stop carrying consequences. Without consequences, they stop carrying meaning. And without meaning, freedom is just an empty gesture, a promise I cannot deliver.